All right, well, welcome to another edition of Traveling Through History. Really glad you're here this evening. We have a very special episode. We have a return guest, and that is author Andrew Lawler, who was on our show some months ago to talk about his great book, Under Jerusalem. We had a great time. It was one of our best episodes ever, and we had tremendous feedback coming out of that. And we talked at the time, Andrew, about coming back when you put this book out early in 2025, A Perfect Frenzy, and now you're back. Well, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back.
How you been doing?
Oh, pretty good. Been on the road talking about the American Revolution. Seems like a good time to do that.
It sure does. It sure does. So the name of the book is A Perfect Frenzy, A Royal Governor, His Black Allies, and the Crisis That Spurred the American Revolution. And of course, we're talking about the royal governor being Lord Dunmore. So how did you get the idea for this book? How did you research it? How did you come up with the idea to write it in the first place?
Well, it all started with the pandemic when my mother, who lives in Norfolk, Virginia, which figures in the book, was kind of trapped in her apartment. So I said, well, why don't we go to Williamsburg? So we went up to the old colonial capital of Virginia and spent a day. And I happened to be in a bookstore and ran into a mention in a book about something called the Ethiopian Regiment. I'd never heard of it. And about the same time, my editor at National Geographic called and said, hey, do you have any ideas for Black History Month? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I think I may. So I started to research a bit about Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment and the Emancipation Proclamation that he put out in 1775. And really, I was stunned to learn that these really important and far-reaching events that happened under my nose of where I grew up had been left out of the textbooks and left out of my family history. So I started to dive into it. And the more I dug, I took a more journalistic approach. It's like, okay, wait, I was told this story, but it doesn't seem to be a complete story. So I wanted to figure out, well, what really happened in those critical days in 1775 and 1776 in Virginia. We know a lot about New England, but Virginia tends to get short shrift at the early bit of the Revolution. So I just started digging, and lo and behold, I came up with that rare thing, a story that really had not been told about the American Revolution.
Wow, it's incredible. And that's your home city, and you were told one thing, and now you're finding out lots of different things about your city you never thought was possible.
Indeed, and much of what I was taught was actually untrue. And so that really gave me the fire to dig deep and to try and go to the primary sources and really try and understand what happened on a day-to-day basis so that I think we could sweep away some of these myths we have that really aren't based on fact.
You know, it's interesting. Preparing for tonight, I did a lot of research myself because I wanted to make sure I asked really good questions. One of the things I did was I looked across Britannica and Wikipedia and all these different sources in the internet that people read about Lord Dunmore, and almost all of them, to the letter, talk about his pounding of Norfolk from the ships and his decimation of Norfolk, and they don't talk at all about the Patriots setting it ablaze and doing all the destruction that they did. I found one place where they talked about it. But why do you think that is? Why even today are we being fed kind of what's really propaganda?
Well, this is a really important story. Norfolk, at that point, was the only city in Virginia. Virginia was a very rural place. Of course, it was mainly tobacco plantations. 4 out of 10 people were enslaved, and Norfolk was the only major port. Williamsburg had maybe a couple of thousand people, whereas Norfolk had about 6,500. So it was a good-sized city. And the destruction of this city was long blamed on Lord Dunmore, and we know, it wasn't anything miraculous that I did to dig up the truth. If the truth has actually been known, it's just not been really broadcast. That the fact is that the city was destroyed by the Patriots for a lot of very interesting reasons that I'm sure we can get into.
Well, I'd love to hear that. That was going to be my next question. What do you think are the reasons? Why would they do that to their own city? And what was the reason behind they would do this kind of destruction to essentially an American city? They didn't really need to. They were coming in anyway.
Yeah, keep in mind that this is the only instance where an American city has been completely destroyed by humans or by even natural disaster. This is a more complete annihilation than than Columbia, South Carolina, or Atlanta,
Hmm.
Georgia, the Civil War, or Chicago with its fire, and San Francisco with its earthquake. So this is a really significant incident that has been, largely ignored in the literature. So Norfolk was the eighth largest city in the country at that point, or in British North America, and it had a very uneasy relationship with the rest of Virginia. So keep in mind that this is a colony that basically is a tobacco growing place. And in that little corner of Virginia, southeastern Virginia, where Norfolk was, you couldn't grow tobacco. The soil didn't really support it. Instead,
Right.
corn and pigs. So it was a different economy. And the fact that Norfolk was a very multiracial city, it had connections to the West Indies, with New England, and with Britain, made it an outlier, you could say, in a colony that was largely run by the rural gentry who had these plantations or forced labor camps. That's really what they were, filled with enslaved Africans. So there was
Hmm.
always tension between these rural people and the gentry who controlled the House of Burgesses in Virginia and this city. So they tried for a century and a half to really try and clamp down on Norfolk, to try and turn it into a kind of plantation that they could control,
Right.
because they were very fearful that this was a place where enslaved people could run away to. You could remake your identity, get lost in the alleys, join a ship. A lot of African Americans worked on the ships in the harbor, worked in the warehouses. So it was always a kind of existential threat to the tightly controlled tobacco economy that really powered Virginia. There was one other reason why Norfolk was disliked by the rural gentry, people like Washington and Jefferson, and that is it was home to Scottish merchants. And this is a story that
Hmm.
really has not been fully told. Uh, this group of merchants from Glasgow arrived in the 1750s and 60s in Norfolk, and they really turned it into a bustling port. These were kind of the early capitalists who brought in, lots of money and expertise. Glasgow was a booming city at that point, and these Scots were able to essentially take over the tobacco business in Virginia. They were the ones who took the tobacco back to Britain. And
Hmm.
they made enormous amounts of money. And a lot of that money they plowed into building factories, building distilleries, building ships, really putting that investment into Norfolk. So uh, they also loaned a lot of money to the tobacco gentry, who were always cash poor. So there was this tension between these Scottish merchants and the tobacco gentry, who needed them but really disliked them and considered them much like Jews were considered at the time. They were considered to be money lenders you couldn't trust. They had very tight knit families, and
Right.
this was a threat to that tobacco gentry.
That makes so much sense. Aren't there two other reasons, though? Another reason would be that they considered that city full of loyalists, right? And at that point, they had made the decision they wanted to separate from England, and they looked at this city full of loyalists that they had to get rid of it. Isn't that another
Well,
reason?
it is and it isn't. Take Philadelphia or Boston or New York. They were also filled with loyalists. There were many people in those cities who
Hmm.
were loyalists, who did not want to separate from Britain. And keep in mind that until really early to even late spring of 1776, most Americans did not support independence. Most Americans thought that by giving the British a bloody nose, they would get what they wanted. That is recognition in Parliament and a reduction in these taxes that they didn't like.
Hmm.
There was really not a strong sense of independence. So, and this is particularly true in Virginia, which had long prided itself on being the Old Dominion, being
Hmm.
loyal to the king. So Virginians were not in 1775 really talking even much about independence. So the funny thing is that you had loyalists in other cities, but nobody proposed destroying Philadelphia or destroying New York because it was filled with loyalists. And in fact, the town council of Norfolk was made up of loyalists and patriots. In fact, there was a
Hmm.
patriot mayor who had the unfortunate name of Mayor Loyal. Um,
Oh, wow. Okay.
so the patriots technically were in charge of this city, even
Okay.
though there were people with loyalist leanings. Because, of course, if you were a merchant, you weren't keen on a boycott because that would ruin your business. So lots of merchants up and down the East Coast opposed what the Continental Congress was doing. But they also realized they couldn't do much about it. You might as well, if you can't beat them, join them. So, and many people in Norfolk were just waiting to see which way the wind blew. So, yes, there were loyalists there, but in other cases, it didn't lead to this kind of, crazed annihilation of an entire
Right.
city.
No, that's right. Do you think there was one final reason, which is strategic, and that is to take Norfolk off the map? You essentially take one of the major ports off the map that the British were trying to use to put down these rebellions. You basically take a port off the map that really hurts the English.
Well, yes, but it also hurts the Americans.
True.
It's a double-edged sword because, in fact, after the destruction of Norfolk, years later, there was an American patriot who wrote to Jefferson and said, we miss Norfolk every day. If we'd only had that port, we would have been able to build up our navy, would have been able to use it against the British. So I think this was an idea that came after the fact.
Right.
People talked about, oh, well, they had to destroy it because it was strategic. Well, Boston was strategic as well. There were lots of strategic cities that weren't destroyed, such as Charleston, such as Savannah. And these were taken over by the British, and they weren't destroyed by the Patriots. So I think the fact that it's an anomaly really puts the lie to that old story.
I think
Because
you're
really, yeah.
I think you're exactly right. I think essentially it was a strategic thing that happened, but it was not by purpose. I think when you see John Marshall writing, who became a Supreme Court justice later, he was one of the soldiers on the ground there and watched it happen. And he wrote multiple Virginia gentry that he thought it was a huge mistake. And so I agree with you. I don't think it was strategically done. I think that was one of the strategic bonuses they got out of it. But
And we know because Thomas Jefferson, at the end of October of 1775, he wrote in a letter to his friend John Page in Virginia, he said, no, in Latin, he wrote, Norfolk must be destroyed. And he wrote it in Latin because it was a reference to the destruction of Carthage by the ancient Romans.
wasn't it
Carthage,
Delendo v.
Delenda est Norfolk, or Delenda est Carthago was the Latin phrase used by Roman senators saying Carthage must be destroyed. And in the end, they did destroy Carthage, even though Carthage had become part of the Roman Empire and was no longer a threat. They still didn't like the fact that the Carthaginians were there. So, by Jefferson, by using this phrase, what he's saying is tantamount to genocide. He's saying we want to destroy this city, not because the British are there, not because it's strategic, not for any reason, but that this is a wicked place that we want to wipe off the map. And the fact that he used that phrase, I think, makes it clear. The Romans did not destroy Carthage because it was a strategic threat. They destroyed it because it was seen as a place that went against Roman values. And it was seen as a place of merchants, whereas Rome was seen as a place of upright farmers. And this is what Jefferson, how he was viewing it, the lens he was viewing it. And of course, this becomes part of our national story because Jefferson went on to argue with Alexander Hamilton during the first Washington administration over whether or not our country should be an urban place with national banks or whether it should be a more rural country with this kind of well-educated yeomanry that would prevent us from falling into the trap of becoming a European-style country. So what happened in Norfolk really had huge implications for what happened later. And of course, even today, we have this huge gap between people who live in rural areas and urban areas that plays out in our politics. So I think this is the first example where you see this trend that so defines America first taking shape.
And we're still trying to become both, right? I mean, we want to be a country that allows both types of living and suburban. So you're right.
There remains tension between these two, and that's why I think this example of Norfolk is so interesting because we can go back and really see the beginning of this hatred between people who were living in rural areas and those who were living in urban areas.
So most of your work has been done around archaeology in the Middle East and other locations around the globe. Was it hard to make the transition to the Revolutionary War? Or was that a difficult transition, or was it easy for you?
Well, I have written a book about the lost colony called The Secret Token that brought me a lot to the coast of North Carolina and some archaeological digs. This was a big challenge, though, because I was writing about the American Revolution, and everybody's dead. I couldn't interview anybody, and I did what I could to find primary sources, but I found it very challenging to pull together all of the material that I needed to really paint a picture for readers of what life was like then. What did the place look like? Why did people do what they did? So it took a lot of research in order to kind of be able to piece it all together. I couldn't just go to Lord Dunmore and say, hey, why did you do this on such and such a day? So I really had to spend more time in the archives than I thought I would in order to get the fuller picture.
And you couldn't go to the Norfolk courthouse, of course, because every building was burned down. So did you go to places like?
Although a lot of the documents are documents that are in Chesapeake, which was,
Oh, okay.
was part of Norfolk County then. But a lot of those, fortunately, were online. I was lucky in that regard. And the Library of Congress. And I also spent a good deal of time in Scotland at the National Library in Edinburgh, where there were lots of great documents, including this whole raft of letters between a guy in Norfolk who was a Scottish merchant and his friend in Scotland, writing about the gossip, and James Parker was his name, and that was a gold mine because
Wow.
he really was in the thick of the gossip network, and so it helped me to paint a much richer picture, I think, of the times.
There's a lot of great documents at the University of Virginia libraries. Did you get a chance to go there?
Yes, and also the Thomas Jefferson Library outside of Monticello was
Right.
very helpful. They had everything I needed on Thomas Jefferson was there.
Fantastic. So how far back did you go with Dunmore? Like how far back in his life did you research? I know he became a very young soldier, British soldier early in his life. How far back did you go and follow up all the way through?
So Lord Dunmore, his birth name was John Murray, and he
Right.
was a minor Scottish aristocrat. So he was part of the Murray clan, with a very very large Scottish clan. He was in kind of the less wealthy side of the clan, and his father in 1745, when Lord Dunmore, our Lord Dunmore, was probably maybe 13, 14, joined the rebellion against King George II, led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, who was a Jacobite. They wanted to put the kings of old back on the throne and get rid of these Germans. So Bonnie Prince Charlie landed in Scotland, but the French forces that were supposed to come with him didn't make it, and so he was there kind of by himself. And he marched through Scotland and gathered allies, people like Dunmore's father. And Dunmore himself went along, and he had a master's class in a rebellion. They almost made it to London. I mean, this rebellion, 20 years before the American Revolution, nearly succeeded in toppling the British regime. It was quite extraordinary and very unexpected. So I was really curious about this because it's something that hadn't been mentioned much by historians, but I felt like such a dramatic time must have shaped Dunmore in ways that hadn't been considered. So the irony is that here's a kid who watches a prince try and overthrow the king of Britain, and then 20 years later, Dunmore is in charge of the largest, wealthiest, most populous colony in British North America, and has to decide whether he's going to put down a rebellion. So, I thought that psychologically it was important for me to understand his early life. Now, his father was convicted of treason when the rebellion failed, and he barely escaped execution and was put under house arrest. So imagine being the son of a man who's convicted of treason. He's a traitor. And this was something that must have haunted Dunmore for his entire life. I also went back and looked at kind of the earlier antecedents of his family when they got their title in the late 1600s. They were kind of Johnny come lately. They were small fry aristocrats who didn't have
Mhm.
didn't have deep pockets. They basically were the lord of a small group of villages in the Highlands that were was very poor. So these were not your people who had giant country houses. The Dunmores were middling aristocrats, to say the least. And this was all interesting because it explained why Dunmore came to America. A lot of Scottish aristocrats in a similar circumstance, without much money, they would go into the civil service. And one of the best ways to get a job was to become a royal governor in British North America and elsewhere in the empire. So
Mhm.
Dunmore was just one of many Scottish aristocrats who took that route in order to have a steady income.
So then he joins the military early, works his way up to being governor of New York. And I read that he was very successful at first in New York, but then he kind of got on the wrong side of some people in New York City who were the movers and shakers in the business community. And that one of the reasons he accepted the governor post in Virginia was because it was getting hot a little bit on his seat there. I know his wife did not want to come. You talk about that in the book, that she wanted to stay in New York. But any thoughts about that? How he kind of wears out his welcome after he's there for a while?
Well, he when he arrived in New York in 1770, he did a decent job, and New York was basically run by two or three very powerful families, and so
Right. Right.
Dunmore inevitably was gonna make enemies. But generally, I think he did a fair job. You look at his legislative record; it was very brief. It was only a year. What happened was that the Virginia governor died, and the king then told Dunmore, go to Virginia. Now, Dunmore should have been pleased with this. It was a promotion. Virginia was a larger colony. It was more
Right.
important. He got a
Mhm.
bigger salary. And for those who've always claimed that Dunmore was only about the money, well, he didn't want to go to Virginia, even though it was a bigger salary. Why?
Mhm.
He liked New York. He liked the intellectual ferment. He liked a city. He liked city life. He didn't want to go to a colony that was known as a rural place, a rather backward place where you could die of some horrible subtropical fever. So he actually did everything he could to avoid taking the post. And the king had to order him. The king got very annoyed and said, get thee to Virginia right away. So finally, Dunmore shows up there in 1771 after the summer has passed. He spent his summer up in the mountains in Vermont,
Right.
very sensibly. And he arrived, and Virginians were aware that he had not wanted the post, so they viewed him very skeptically. They also knew he was a Scot, and the most of the Virginia gentry at the time were of English descent, Washington, Jefferson. These were people who came from English stock. And at that time, people remembered the rebellion of 1745, which was centered in Scotland. And so they didn't much like Scots. Scots were seen as drunken barbarians who were constantly, causing trouble up there in the north. So a Scottish governor was viewed already, no matter how good they were, as someone to keep an eye on.
And so, what were some of the good things and the bad things he did when he got to Virginia? I know his wife very much didn't want him to come, but he dissolved the Virginia Burgesses in 1772. He dissolved them in 1773. He was already angering people for doing that. He did lead Dunmore's War in 1774 to go grab land out of the Ohio Valley for Virginia. So that was very popular.
Actually, for the first 3 years of Dunmore's tenure, he was he did a great job, and the Virginia gentry came to really like him because he represented their interests. He bought plantations, he bought enslaved people. He became one of the gentry, these tobacco planters,
Hmm.
who were all about getting more land so they could plant more tobacco and make more money. So one of his good friends was George Washington. Washington was an up and
Right.
coming planter, and he befriended Washington befriended Dunmore for good reason, because
Hmm.
in order to move west, they had to have the approval of the king. But the king had been very clear: no white people could legally own land west of the Appalachian Mountains because there were indigenous people there, and he knew that as soon as the white settlers went over the mountains, they were going to get into a war, and the British would have to pay the bill. That's what had happened in the French and Indian War 20 years earlier. So the king had drawn a line down the chain of mountains and said, white people stay to the east, indigenous people are to the west. And this was a source of enormous frustration for land speculators like Washington, who had really set their sights on becoming wealthy by getting this great bottom land to be found in the Ohio. The intention was to bring their slaves and to clear the area, plant tobacco, and they were going to become incredibly rich. And both Washington and Dunmore shared this vision, and Washington really hoped that Dunmore could use his power in order to convince the king to allow Virginia to expand. So for those first 3 years, Dunmore was beloved by these speculators because he did whatever he could to support them. He also did things that Virginia needed. He was key in trying to convince the Virginians to build a lighthouse, build better roads, better infrastructure. Virginia was a very backward place where the gentry didn't want to spend tax money. They didn't want to be taxed and they didn't want to spend the money. The education was incredibly poor. I mean, this was a place that was, compared to New England, was very, very backward indeed. And Dunmore, as a man of the Scottish Enlightenment, he brought the largest private library in the colonies. He brought scientific instruments. He brought a huge number of musical instruments. And he was a cultured person who also wanted to get things done, that kind of pragmatic Scottish, let's dig some canals, let's start the Industrial Revolution. I mean, this is how Dunmore saw his role in Virginia, to try and get this backward colony to improve itself. And he made some headway in those first years.
And he wanted to build some infrastructure, which is admirable. That's good.
Yeah.
So he rides back into Williamsburg in 1774 after Dunmore's War, kind of a hero. I mean, his popularity
and
was
let's
at its peak.
explain what that war is. So the war was something that it infuriated King George III because what happened was there had been fights between indigenous people, particularly Shawnees and other tribes, and the white settlers who were illegally moving over into that area. And after a few scuffles between them and a massacre or two, Dunmore collected an army, marched west, defeated the Shawnees, and signed a peace treaty that basically gave all of this, what's now the state of Kentucky, to Virginia. So he virtually doubled the size of Virginia in one fell swoop with very little violence.
Right.
So this made him a very popular man indeed among white Virginians.
So, and I also read somewhere that Pennsylvania was also interested in that Ohio land, and that he had to kind of fend them off because they were trying to march west, and so he had
Yes.
other colonies were looking at the same land.
Oh yeah, and Pennsylvania actually claimed Pittsburgh, which is a very strategic place where rivers come
Mhm.
together to form the Ohio, and Virginia was claiming it as well. So Dunmore really pushed the envelope on this and was claiming Pittsburgh for Virginia for various reasons, and it nearly came to war. You almost had war between these two colonies
Right.
right as the American Revolution is beginning. So we tend not to remember this conflict, Dunmore's War, or the near war between Pennsylvania and Virginia, because it was overshadowed by a much larger war.
And also, he's marching into Williamsburg triumphantly while war is breaking out up north that they don't know about yet. You have Lexington and Concord happening and a bunch of other things. So it's just interesting. Lots of things happening all across the colonies.
But what's really important, what really surprised me was that Virginians, and when I say Virginians, let's talk about the white Virginians who were kind of small farmers or
Right.
hunters, not the big plantation owners and not the enslaved people who didn't have a say. But that's kind of the middle population. They had very little interest in fighting the British Empire. They were not concerned about tariffs or tea. In fact, Patrick Henry says this. He said, you can talk to the people about taxes and tea and tariffs, but these are abstracted notions that they won't understand. But if you tell them that the British are coming for their guns, then they will join us. And this is what Patrick Henry did. He convinced people that the British were coming to get their guns and ammunition. And Dunmore did actually seize a few barrels of gunpowder in the arsenal
Right.
in
Right.
Williamsburg, which technically you could argue were his. He was the governor. They were under his control. The Patriots disputed that, but it was a very small number. It was like it was a dozen and a half kegs, not enough to even fight a skirmish, but it was a symbolic move. And this is what the Patriots used to really get people riled up, because what the Virginia Patriot leaders wanted at that point was to force Britain to allow them to get this land out west. Tea was a secondary matter. Tariffs were a secondary matter. Most Virginians were not merchants. The
Hmm.
tobacco planters It was the Scots who were the merchants. So, the Virginians had a very, very different approach to their relationship to Britain than did those in New England.
Yeah, so the "Give Me Liberty, Give Me Death" speech was at the Virginia Burgesses that was meeting off-site without Dunmore's knowledge, and really kind of doing things behind his back, which I'm sure angered him. But what else did he do to get sideways with the Virginians other than the gunpowder incident?
Well, a day after the gunpowder incident, things had kind of calmed down, and the armed mob that had threatened the palace kind of stood down. But a day later, we don't know exactly what happened. I suspect that Dunmore got news that there would be an attempt to attack him and his family, his wife and kids, and the few British redcoats that he had at the palace in the middle of Williamsburg. It was a very hard building to defend. He had very few weapons, very few soldiers. So Dunmore was in a very vulnerable position. Remember, British troops and ships were concentrated in Boston. There's very, very few forces in Virginia. A couple of ships, a couple of dozen redcoats and Marines, not more than that. So Dunmore, I believe, he received a threat that he held to be credible, that the Patriots were going to cause trouble. And he told a doctor who came in for a visit at the palace, for a house visit, he said, "You let people know that if anyone tries to harm me or my men, I will free the slaves." Now, these were fighting words because the Virginia governor's primary role for 100 years had been to prevent slave insurrections, to ensure that this 40% of the population was kept under absolute control and did not get weapons or training, and were unable to get together to plot any kind of rebellion. So for Dunmore to say this was a hugely shocking thing that spread up and down the East Coast. It was reported in papers all over. And it gave a lot of hope to enslaved people who thought, oh, okay, well, if there is a fight with Britain, maybe the British will be on our side. Because the Patriots were not talking about emancipation. They were not talking about providing liberty to those who were living in lifetime servitude. That wasn't part of the conversation. So this was a really key moment when Dunmore is offering hope to these enslaved Africans, and he's terrifying white Virginians and other whites throughout the colonies. Because remember, white Virginians lived in fear that a black person would slit their throats at night or poison their food or run away and they lose their investment. So
Right.
there was so much anxiety already in the way that they had set their society up with people who had no say, no liberty, and who they presumed, might turn violent. That Dunmore's threat was taken was really a shock to the Patriot system.
Do you think he said that threat out of desperation because he had so few troops, or do you think he really was an abolitionist from the very beginning?
Oh, I don't think Dunmore was ever an abolitionist, but I think that he realized that this was a short-term threat that could save him, and it worked twice. When he made the threat twice in April of 1775, and twice the Patriots stood down. Not only did they stand down, but they came back in June of 1775. The House of Burgesses reconvened, and it was like nothing had happened. So I think Dunmore was very, very clever. He realized that he didn't have the troops to fend off the Patriots, but
Right.
simply by making this threat, it was enough to protect him during that period. And he made no move, as far as we know, to actually arm black men. But the threat was hanging there, and people knew it was there. So I think it was actually probably a smart move on his part to avoid violence.
So, what was the trigger to actually make him load up his family and move down to Norfolk because he didn't feel like he could stay in Williamsburg?
Uh,
What was the
so in
what was the
in
trigger there?
Yeah, this is such a great story. In June of 1775, the House of Burgesses, as I mentioned, was meeting. They were supposed to consider a peace plan sent by the British, and in the course of that uh, legislative session, Dunmore suddenly one night vanishes, and the next thing the Burgesses know, He's on a ship in Yorktown, a dozen miles away, on a Royal Navy warship. What happened? Now, there's a lot of speculation, and I pulled some pieces together, and what I think clearly took place is that we know Dunmore, the night he vanished, had dinner with the Attorney General John Randolph, who was the brother of Peyton Randolph, who was the titular head of the
Right.
Patriot movement, president of the Congress. So he had dinner with John, and they were good friends. And on his way home, I suspect somebody, possibly an enslaved person, said, "Hey, I hear of a plot. They're going to kidnap you. You got to get out of town." And he went back to the palace, and what we know happened was he immediately had everybody pack things up, packed everything up that he could, and they got into carriages in the middle of the night, and they left Williamsburg under the cover of darkness. And next morning, they're safe on a Royal Navy ship. Now, you could say, well, he got scared, but remember that Dunmore was a military man. He had fought in a war. He had led thousands of men. He could have fled the palace long before, but he never did. I think he was a man of enormous bravery. So I don't think he ran away because of some idle boast or idle threat. I think he ran away because he had intelligence about a plot. And later we know that in the Continental Congress, they actually discussed the fact that this plot had existed. Now, whether the Patriots were going to actually do it or not, it's unclear. But Dunmore probably acted in a very sane manner by getting out of town before the Patriots could grab him. Now, remember, even after he's on this ship and has fled Williamsburg, the Burgesses are constantly sending him letters saying, "Please come back. We promise we won't harm you. You're safe here. We're so embarrassed that you and your ladyship had to leave. Bring your kids back. You'll be fine." They didn't just say good riddance to you. They actually were horrified at the prospect of a royal governor fleeing for his life. It didn't look good for these Virginians who considered themselves to be staunch members of the British Empire.
Absolutely. So, do you think there's anything he could have done to change the course of history, to not allow this whole situation to unravel, to prevent Virginia from wanting independence? Obviously they're hearing in their newspapers what's going on up north. Is there anything he really could have done without the support that he didn't receive?
Well, I think he did probably as much as any person could do. So Dunmore in July of 1775 finds himself pretty much alone. I mean, he's on there's a couple of Royal Navy ships, but not many troops. He sends his family back to England. John Randolph and others leave. They go back to England. It's pretty much just Dunmore. And at that point, one would think that he would leave too. Other royal governors were leaving at that time. Some were put in jail. Benjamin Franklin's son, for example, was put in jail. He was a governor. So the peculiar thing is that Dunmore stayed. And I kept asking myself, why? Why didn't he just get on the ship and go? They would have understood in London. They would have known. It's like, hey, you had no troops. You had no serious navy. There was no way you could have overcome thousands and thousands of armed men. So when I then thought back about Dunmore's past, I realized when I looked at the calendar, it was exactly 20 years earlier to the month, Bonnie Prince Charlie landed in Scotland with supposedly like seven friends. That was it. And from that core, he created an army that nearly toppled the head of the British Empire.
Right.
So I think that our best guess is that at that point, Dunmore realized that he could do what Bonnie Prince Charlie had done, that he could build an army out of nothing. He knew he was not going to get much support from Britain or Boston. They were busy. But he knew he'd watched Bonnie Prince Charlie do this. And the people that he was going to depend most on were enslaved Virginians. Why? Well, as early as the days after he fled to Yorktown on that ship, enslaved Africans began to show up asking for sanctuary on these ships. And they were granted sanctuary, many were. This infuriated the Patriots. From the Patriots' point of view, enslaved people were property. And for the British to hold their property on a ship was tantamount to stealing their property, which under law, under Virginia law, it was illegal. So the British were doing something illegal. So this was the argument that the patriots were using. This is what really angered the white Virginian patriots. It was their slaves finding refuge on these Royal Navy ships. So Dunmore had been seeing these guys show up, and women and children show up for a couple of months. And I think he realized that if he played his cards right, he could create an army that had a lot of black men in it that could potentially change the formula, really change the picture and provide him with a chance to beat back the Patriots and get back to Williamsburg and to force them to surrender.
Wasn't he just essentially a very loyal guy coming from the military? He was a Scot. He just seemed to be incredibly loyal. If you were on his side, he was going to back you all the way. And what he put up with, think about getting pushed out of Williamsburg, pushed down to Norfolk, everything he went through trying to defend Norfolk. Then he gets pushed out onto the ships. And for 8 months, they're on a floating city. He and all of these people are on all these makeshift boats. Half of them die from different, scourges and diseases and starvation. And he still stays. It is incredible.
It is amazing because at any point, the destruction of Norfolk, for example, or even earlier, the Battle of Great Bridge, a very important conflict between the British and Loyalists, including the Ethiopian Regiment, where you have Black Americans fighting against white Americans.
Right.
In the end, the British and the Loyalists lose. At that point, Dunmore could have gotten on his ships. He put his troops on the ships. He put the Ethiopian Regiment members and their family members on ships. They could have sailed away, but no, he stayed, as you say, he stayed and continued until August of 1776, continued to pose a really potentially lethal threat to the Patriot cause in Virginia. And George Washington, who was pretty busy up there in Cambridge, fighting the British, he said, if we don't destroy Lord Dunmore, then we could be done for. I mean, he could become the biggest enemy that we face. So I think it's hard to really grasp what a threat Dunmore posed. He didn't just sail away; he stayed because I think you're right. He felt I don't know if it's loyalty, but I think he felt like it was his job. He couldn't simply walk away and leave these loyalists to be destroyed, imprisoned, tortured, killed by the Patriots. He knew that would happen, and he knew that already had happened to those Ethiopian Regiment members who were captured by the Patriots. Many of them were sent to prison, terrible prison in Williamsburg, and then many of them were then later sent to work in the lead mines in Western Virginia, kind of state-sponsored Appalachian gulag, where they produced the bullets to kill the British. So Dunmore was aware of how terrible the consequences would be on the Loyalists if he left. So I think that was a big reason he chose to stay. Also, we can't forget that all his stuff was there. All of his land, his enslaved people, his everything he owned was in Virginia. And if he went back to Britain, he was going to be penniless.
That's very true. So, but just imagine living on this floating city for 8 months and how horrific. They lost 2/3 of the people in those 8 months. So it's really incredible.
Well, I would, there's another way of seeing it. And yes, a lot of people died. In part, that's because, the terrible sanitary conditions on this flotilla. But also remember, it's 3,000 people on maybe 100 to 200 ships. I mean, this is the largest flotilla, civilian and military flotilla in American history. And they actually landed and created a base just downstream from Norfolk. It's now called Hospital Point. And there they built a fort. They had ovens. They had grounds to drill the troops. They had a flour making operation. They had, they really made it work. So yes, a lot of people died, but I think that we may overstate how terrible it was, mainly because most of our information comes from the Patriots, and they were big on making it sound as terrible as possible because they didn't want their enslaved people who were still on the plantations to go join Dunmore. So they had to make it sound as awful as possible. So
it's essentially propaganda. That's what it is.
Yeah,
across the board.
it was absolutely propaganda, and they were desperate to keep people from going to Dunmore.
Right.
So, we know they had courts, we know they had pastors of different faiths, we know that they had a printing press, they were printing a newspaper. I mean, this was a full-fledged community. So despite the difficulties, I think that mostly they had enough food and water. There were tough times in there, but the local people were showing up. People in Norfolk had made their
Right.
livelihood for 100 years in feeding people on ships. Any ship that came in, you took your cabbages out there, you sold it. This trade continued. So
Right.
they actually were able to have supplies.
It's really impressive that they were able to stay together. You're right. I did notice the number one cause of death was smallpox.
There was an inoculation then.
Was there? Okay.
So what happened was that smallpox arrived probably in a British transport in Boston in
Mhm.
1775, and it spread. And George Washington, who had suffered from smallpox and survived it as a teenager, he understood that disease. So it's only because he immediately put people in lockdown, he immediately created quarantine situations, he
Mhm.
saved the Continental Army from destruction. Now, Dunmore understood just as well as Washington what was at stake, but people on ships, it's very hard to quarantine, and it was
Right.
just impossible. Once the smallpox virus got loose in the fleet, that's when the real devastation began. So
Right.
uh, they decided to inoculate the Ethiopian Regiment first and foremost, which is interesting. They decided to inoculate the black people, the black soldiers first, because they were really the key for Dunmore's defense. So to do that, though, when you inoculated somebody, you come down typically with a mild form of the virus. You're
Right.
sick for a couple of weeks, so you can't. He couldn't do that when you had patriots threatening. So he picked up this flotilla. They moved up to a place called Gwynn's Island, more isolated place in the Chesapeake Bay. They
Mhm.
inoculated those black soldiers that they could, and meanwhile, more people keep coming.
Right.
More black people and white loyalists keep showing up. It's really extraordinary to see that at a time you would think that Dunmore is a loser. Why go there? Oh my God, everybody's dying of smallpox. You
Right.
read in the newspapers, it made it sound like it was a terrible situation, and yet people continue to show up
Right.
and join the loyalist cause. I think that really says a lot about the state of slavery in Virginia, where people were
Right.
willing to risk death in order to for the chance of emancipation. Because we didn't mention that on
Right.
November 15th, 1775, Dunmore had kind of formalized the fact that enslaved people were showing up and wanted to fight for the British by allowing them freedom in exchange for military service.
Yeah. Tell us about his Emancipation Proclamation, because obviously that was well in advance of the one that we got in the Civil War from President Lincoln. And I noticed that proclamation, I read it, and it's partially releasing the slaves who will come fight for the crown. And it was partially threatening that he was going to burn Williamsburg to the ground, which I thought was an interesting threat.
Well, that was a threat that he made in April. In November of 1775, so Dunmore was trying to secure the area around Norfolk. So he was marching with his troops, including at least some black men who had weapons, and they were ambushed by a patriot group, a patriot militia group. And in the battle that followed, the patriot militia commander was captured and brought to Dunmore by his former slave.
Oh, wow.
The man who had been enslaved by the Patriot militia commander, this man, we don't know his name, he captured the militia commander, brought him to Dunmore. And immediately then, Dunmore, obviously impressed, I think he realized these guys are tough, they will fight, they're motivated, they're going to be on my side. And
Hmm.
there are tens of thousands of them. There are 200,000 of them in Virginia. So he put out this Emancipation Proclamation, which freed those who were enslaved by patriots, not by loyalists, and said, if you show up, I will give you freedom, and then I'll give you a gun, which was illegal under Virginia law. So he was breaking every rule in the book by putting out this proclamation, but it was very effective because people began to flock in even larger numbers, coming from as far away as Massachusetts, to
Wow.
find freedom behind British lines. And it really scared the Patriots, because they
I bet.
realized that if enough people showed up, that it might be very hard to continue their fight against Britain.
Is it crazy to think that people were fighting for freedom on both sides? I mean, it's really pretty
No, this
astounding.
is, I mean, this is, when I was 10 years old and I was taught about the good guys and bad guys, that was appropriate. But I think now that we're 250 years old
Right.
this year, and next year, I think we can handle the truth, which is that most Black Americans, if they had to choose a side, they chose the British side. Why? Because they were offering liberty. The
Right.
Patriots did not offer liberty in the way the British did. And
Hmm.
the British stuck to their promise. They kept their promise. They made sure that 3,000 people were evacuated from New York in 1783,
Hmm.
rather than being left for the Patriots to re-enslave. It's one of those shameful moments in American history where
Sure.
our leaders, including George Washington, sent slave catchers into British-controlled New York to try and get their slaves back. People who had
Right.
been emancipated 5, 6, 7 years previously, the Patriots insisted on getting their property back. So, I think we have to recognize that this doesn't take away anything from the fight for liberty, but I think we can honor people who are fighting for liberty no matter what color coat they were wearing.
I admire them on both sides. I really do. So tell us about the Ethiopian Regiment, because you walked into that bookstore knowing nothing about it. You looked at the book and you said, "What is this?" So what have you learned about it? What was the research around it that you did?
Well, this was the first Black troop organized in the British Empire.
Right.
So it's very significant. And I think Dunmore did that. He didn't mix them in because the British Army was a pretty staid and prejudiced group of people. Unlike the Royal Navy, where they had very multiracial crews were the norm in the British Navy. And that's partly why enslaved people went to the Royal Navy ships and they were generally welcomed. But the army was a little tougher. They didn't like fighting with these Black people. So Dunmore was careful to set them aside, and he brought in white Virginia officers to train and drill these men. Remember, most of these people had never touched a gun. It was illegal for a slave to own a gun or any weapon, even to own a staff or something like that, or a sword, was forbidden under Virginia law. So these people had to be trained in a very, very fast fashion because there was a Patriot army that was marching toward Norfolk to destroy Dunmore.
Right. It
So
really is historic.
he had to whip this together very quickly. So you had the Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment, and the name is important. Why Ethiopian? We know that most enslaved people in Virginia came from West Africa, 1,000 miles away from the country Ethiopia, which is in East Africa.
Right.
But Ethiopia was a term of respect, one of those rare terms of respect that Europeans accorded to Africans. Ethiopia was a Christian country. It was considered very civilized, full of sages. It was honored. So for Dunmore to choose that phrase, I think was indicates that he saw these people with respect. They weren't just cannon fodder, as a lot of patriots later claimed, and many historians still claim. He put his name on it. It was Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment, not just
Right.
the Ethiopian Regiment. So again, he's associating himself with them, giving them a name of honor. And in his writings, he really goes out of his way to say, "Oh, we have this terrible sickness. It's we've lost a lot of fine men." He's used terms that aren't commonly
Right.
used by white
Right.
people in describing Black people. So I think that Dunmore over time really grew to respect these men because they had risked imprisonment and even worse by simply leaving their plantations. They had broken the law.
Why do you think that he was able to make that transition from Virginia plantation owner, where he was trying to be like the gentry? He owned slaves himself. How was he able to make that transition to essentially commander of these guys and respected them greatly?
Well, obviously the force of circumstances. I think
Right.
when he was sitting on that ship in July of 1775, trying to figure out how am I going to make an army, I think he thought it through and he realized, I've seen these enslaved people who have shown up. They want to fight for me. Let's give it a go. I think as a Scottish Highlander, he had a different view of black people than most English whites did. Now, why? Because the Scots had been treated poorly by the English for a long time. They were considered even a lesser species by some English. They simply were frowned upon, looked down upon. So I think Dunmore had experienced that in his life, and so I think he understood these enslaved people maybe a little bit better than some of the English who were
Interesting.
generals at the time. So
The Scots,
yeah, he
the
was
Scots
able.
were very different for sure. You're right. They were very different. The Scots never
And
considered.
remember that Bonnie Prince Charlie's army in 1745 was a multi ethnic army. There were French, there were English, there were Scottish, there were even apparently some French Africans that were there at the time. So it was a mix of people. So I think Dunmore thought he could create this kind of army, what the Patriots called a mongrel army, and the Patriots really hated this idea of a
Right.
multiracial army because it really threatened everything that they believed, and that was in a social system where the black people are at the bottom and they're slaves and the white people are at the top, and
Right.
that's the way nature created it. So what Dunmore was doing was radical in so many ways, although I don't think that he was an abolitionist. I don't think he ever embraced abolitionism. I think it was a matter of a military commander who witnessed people who showed bravery in the face of enormous odds, and that gained his respect.
That's an incredible story that you've uncovered. It really is. Do you know why he didn't go by Governor John Murray and why he always went by Lord Dunmore? What was the reason for that?
Well,
Because
that was traditional. When he received the title of fourth Earl of Dunmore when his father died. Even though his father was a traitor, he still got the title. So at that time, people used the title. So he was John Murray until his father died, and the title passed to him. So from then on, he
gotcha.
was an earl. So the fourth Earl of Dunmore is his kind of formal title that was passed down. And he generally he was known as Lord Dunmore or his lordship. I mean, that was the way people addressed him. Even George Washington and others addressed him in that way rather than, hey, John. He was an aristocrat and he was treated with respect by the British and by the Americans as well.
So, how did the Ethiopian Regiment actually perform on the battlefield? They had very little training. They were trained very quickly. They were not English regulars, which, of course, were the best in the world. What was your research there about how they actually performed?
Well, the best example is what happened at the beginning of the Battle of Great Bridge. Now, the Battle of Great Bridge is known generally by historians as really one battle where a British column marched out. They were mowed down by the patriots who were
Right.
safe behind earthworks. And it's
Right.
true. That was the last battle. But what I discovered were a whole series of skirmishes that took place
Right.
south of that. I'm sorry, north or downstream of the Elizabeth River. So what happened was you had the British on and the Loyalists on one bank of the river, and then you had the Patriots who filled in on the other bank. And there was a ferry crossing, and at that ferry crossing, there was a series of skirmishes. It was the first time that there was a recorded fight between black men who were armed and part of an organized unit that actually attacked the Patriots, and the Patriots were freaked out by this because they believed that black men would never fight, that they would run away, they were cowards. This was the
Hmm.
the word that they had read about in the Virginia Gazette, that of course these people
Hmm.
wouldn't fight. In fact, they fought ferociously, and
Wow.
they really gave these patriots a run for their money. Now, the patriots weren't necessarily well-trained troops either. I mean, a lot of
Right.
these were farmers. Maybe they had been in Dunmore's war, but most had never seen combat. Most had never seen a red coat. So, both sides, I think, were very inexperienced in combat. And in the end, it was just the sheer numbers of patriots that
Right.
overwhelmed the British and
Right.
Ethiopian forces.
Absolutely. So, what was your theory about why England or Britain seemed to leave Dunmore and his government in Virginia kind of naked in some way in terms of protection? I mean, it just didn't make any sense. It was the biggest colony, the most important colony, and yet it just seemed like they sent them, 50 troops and said, "You're on your own."
It really was, I believe, the biggest strategic mistake made by the British in the American Revolution.
Right.
Uh, if they had if they had sent their invasion force to Virginia rather than to Charleston, then the war might have turned out very, very differently. Now, why do I say that? Well, because we know that Dunmore had established, a good base in Norfolk, even though Norfolk had been destroyed, but he established a fort nearby. He was in control of this huge hinterland that provided lots of corn and beef and pork, and I mean the supplies were endless in this very productive land. And it was also, the waterways were such that without a navy, which the Patriots didn't have, the British would have been control. They would have had total control of the region. Dunmore simply didn't have enough ships and enough troops. So if the British had concentrated their forces in Virginia, it would have been very different. Instead, and I'll tell you why they did this. No, so Henry Clinton, who was the British general,
Right.
came down from New York and visited Dunmore on his way to rendezvous with the big fleet coming from Ireland. Uh, he actually chatted with Dunmore, and I think he really thought, maybe this is a better place to come than Charleston. But when he met up with the fleet commander, Peter Parker was a dashing naval hero, and his interest was in conquering a really important city, not some swampy area and a city that's already been destroyed. And why go there? He wanted to get Charleston because that was the jewel of the South. So it was really that ego, that naval ego, which forced Clinton had to go along with him. And so they ended up trying to attack Charleston. It was a disaster, and the British never recovered in the South from that disaster. So if they had focused on Virginia, I think there's very little doubt, and the Patriots themselves really knew that if the British had landed there, they would have taken over. The British could have split the colonies. Virginia, being the most important colony, would have been out of the battle. And I think it's very clear that there would have been no Declaration of Independence without the unanimous approval of Virginia that happened in May of 1776.
So your theory about him being a Scot and being kind of a second class citizen, that wasn't part of it, because he was starting to write letters in late 1774 about how he needed more resources. And then, of course, the conversation with George Clinton there in Norfolk, basically begging him for more troops, still denied. You don't think it was that he was a Scot? That wasn't part of it?
I didn't find any evidence of that. It's certainly possible that Dunmore wasn't particularly well liked. I think in some ways, partly because he was a Scot, partly because he tended to be blunt. Um, but I think it really was that the British knew very little about geography. They didn't understand the strategic value of the Chesapeake Bay,
Okay.
and the focus was on capturing big cities. That was the way wars were fought in the 18th century. And Virginia had no big cities. And after Norfolk was destroyed, it had no cities at all. So I think they saw it as strategically unimportant because there weren't large centers of population that were concentrated. Charleston, Savannah, New York. I mean, this is where the British put all their attention, which of course turned out to be a dreadful mistake. Like the Americans in Vietnam, they were trapped in these cities and could never really control the hinterland.
So Washington and all the other plantation owners who had all been friends with him over the years and thought he did a good job those first couple of years all turned on him pretty quickly. What was the political expediency there to turn on Dunmore and essentially make him the pariah of Virginia?
Yeah, I mean, up until early 1775, Dunmore and Washington were quite close. They were dining together at the palace. They were going to the theater together. They even had planned a trip out to the Ohio together that didn't work out. So it all changed in April of 1775, and this is arguably the most consequential month in American history. Lexington and Concord happened,
Hmm.
and the gunpowder incident in Williamsburg that kind of sparks the conflict in the South. But
Hmm.
during that month, Washington remained remarkably silent. Uh, Except he wrote a letter to Dunmore saying, "Hey, I really, I hear that you pulled my surveyors from the Ohio, and I really want to get it back out there. And hey, can we work this out?" And he wrote a very long letter, uh, virtually begging Dunmore to allow him to survey land in the West. And he clearly wanted to have nothing to do with those people who wanted to kidnap or harm the governor, because George Washington was a land speculator first and foremost at that point, and his future was getting Dunmore to allow him to have this land. People didn't see independence looming in the distance. That's, in
Right.
retrospect, we can say. So Washington played it cool there until I think it was clear that that the king was not going to allow the settlers to move west and for Washington to gain this land. And at that point, I think he decided, let's throw in with the patriots. Let's fight Britain so that we can be free and have the liberty to take the land from the indigenous people. And that sounds cynical, but I think that was just the reality on the ground.
Do you think that it wasn't? I mean, slavery was a big portion of this conflict, as it was in the Civil War, and we know that. But do you think it also was the taxation without representation? I mean, the colonies were really feeling like that. They were becoming wealthy over time, but they were getting a lot of their wealth taken away via taxes and via duties. Do you think
Well, I
taxation without representation was a big part of it? Because they're essentially facing a monarch.
Well, no, they weren't, because Britain was not a monarchy. Britain was a parliamentary system which had a king who was under strict control. The king could not appropriate any money, much like the U.S. president. So this idea that King George III was some kind of tyrant is patently absurd. It's ridiculous. He wasn't like the French king, who indeed was a monarch, who had total control. But King George III did not, and that's the irony, is that we ended up adopting, to a certain extent, the British system, because it was remarkably democratic for its day. So and I think we need to differentiate between New England and the middle colonies in the South. So I won't speak about New England, but I can speak about Virginia. In Virginia, there was not a big outcry about tea or about tariffs because, as we discussed,
Right.
well, first of all, most regular Virginians weren't drinking tea; they drank cider, and they weren't merchants, so they weren't competing with the British. They didn't want to necessarily sell things to France like in New England, because they didn't own the ships. The Scots owned the ships. So the Virginians, the gentry in particular, they were focused on getting land in the West. That was the most important thing for them. And they wanted to ensure that Britain did not interfere with their enslaved people. And there was already rumblings that Britain was going to free the slaves even before the Revolution. So I think white Virginians were afraid that Britain would interfere with Virginia's economy by boxing them in, not letting them move west, and by meddling with their slaves. So these were two fears long before the Revolution began that really was at the top of their agenda.
But there was a hatred of George. It might have been irrational, but I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. We call our basketball team the Hornets because, as you know, when the British came through here, they called it a hornet's nest. And the people here hated George III, but they loved his wife Charlotte, and they actually
Right.
called the city Charlotte. So, and of course, Charlottesville is also named after her. So, I'm interested. Why is it that they hated George so much?
Well, they didn't. This is one of these fallacies that we've been left with as a result of faulty history. Until 1775, most Americans, viewed the king, as a benign person who lived very far away, who had very little impact on their lives. He was a symbolic, head of the empire. There was not a lot of hatred toward him, except among, some small groups of people in New England, and particularly in Boston.
Right.
And maybe Jefferson and a couple of, more radical Virginians. But, again, Virginians really prided themselves on being loyalists. They prided themselves on the fact that they stood by the king in the 17th century when Cromwell sent a fleet to Virginia to convince them to show those Virginians that they couldn't be royalists. They couldn't stand up to the king. Cavaliers, right? The
Right.
Virginia Cavaliers,
That's right.
Charlottesville, the UVA team.
Yep.
So Virginia's had this history of really siding with the monarch side of the tablet,
Right.
and it really was this threat that the British might take their guns and Dunmore's move to take the ammunition, and his threat to free the slaves. I mean, these three things combined to ignite the revolution in Virginia.
Gotcha.
Very, very different dynamic from what was happening at the same time in New England.
Absolutely right. I think you're right. It's those three things. And obviously they wanted to push west and England didn't want them to. So that'd be the fourth thing. So up north, it was about the Boston Massacre. It was about the Tea Party. There was a bunch of powder kegs that happened up there, Lexington and Concord. But Virginia, like you said,
it was about people like John Hancock, who was a merchant, but he was a smuggler. They wanted to be able to sell their goods wherever they could, not have to take stuff to Britain.
right.
So they felt constrained. They felt like that went against liberty. But it was just part of the mercantilist philosophy of the day. I mean, Britain said, "You're going to be a member of the empire. You got to trade with us. You can't trade with our enemies." So from the British side, that was perfectly reasonable. But for people like John Hancock, it was ridiculous. So this was as I understand it, a major kind of subplot going on in New England that was not true in Virginia, since Virginians as a whole did not own any ships and they did very little international commerce.
So when you grew up as a boy in Norfolk, was it particularly historically charged there? I mean, were the schools really interested in history? They talked about it all the time. I know you talked about the cannonball on the wall that
Oh
you
yeah.
saw.
Yeah, I mean, it was not in my family. This was not about book learning. We would go to Williamsburg. We would go to Yorktown. I've got the picture. I've got the Polaroids to prove it. And we would go to any historic site, Civil War sites, you name it. So it was just part and parcel of who we were, and that's part of why I was so floored and upset, and then ultimately kind of angry that I had not been told the full truth. And in fact,
Right,
many of the things I was told, like the British Lord Dunmore burned Norfolk, were in fact patently wrong, and that people had known,
right,
historians have known since the 19th century that this is not what happened. We have a report from 1777
right,
written by patriots that lays out the patriot destruction of 96% of the city of Norfolk.
right.
That was covered up for 50 or 60 years. So, that really got me worked up, because I don't like being lied to by anybody, and particularly if it has to do with my childhood myths. I felt a duty to try and set things straight.
It's interesting you mentioned that report. Why do you think it was suppressed for so long? Because it was done by patriots who didn't really like Dunmore. It's not like it was a pro Dunmore crowd. They were
Oh
just trying to
no, no. In
do their
fact,
job.
everybody they interviewed had to be a good patriot. So no, this is a committee that was set up by the Virginia General Assembly, by the Virginia Patriots, to find out what happened the previous year, because landowners were screaming bloody murder, saying, "We lost our home, we lost our business. Somebody needs to pay us something." I mean, imagine if in this country today, if a whole city was destroyed and nobody took responsibility. So
Incredible.
the Patriots then very wisely set up a committee, and they did an excellent job. I'm
Right,
astounded by how precise they were in doing measurements, finding out who owned what home, who burned what when, and their results were completely believable and very conclusive, that the Patriots on purpose had burned the city, not in some
right,
orgy of destruction. And I think this was kept secret because it was embarrassing.
right.
The Patriots used the destruction of Norfolk to recruit people to their cause.
Hmm.
Think about it. When news spread that Lord Dunmore had burned Norfolk, who was next? New York, Philadelphia, Charleston. So
Right,
I think at that point, people realized that there's no negotiating with these people. They're burning our cities. We might as well declare independence. So this
right.
really was a major spark that helped push the Patriots over the finish line and achieve the Declaration of Independence.
What's
Without
amazing is they
the Norfolk, it would have been much harder.
What's amazing is they didn't need to do it because they were in Norfolk. They were occupying the city. Now the people there weren't real thrilled with them, but they were occupying the city. There was no threat, and they didn't need to do it. So I really wonder why they did.
I think it was what we talked about at the beginning. It was this long-standing hatred of a multiracial city that was kind of not in the control of the tobacco
Mhm.
gentry, and that rural whites really hated simply because it was a multiracial place. There were free blacks there, people of many ethnicities. It was a strange and foreign place to them, and
Interesting.
therefore I think there was just this feeling that it had to be destroyed. And this was something that was true in the depositions. You could see in the officers as well as the enlisted men, they all felt the same way. They all wanted to just destroy the city because they saw it as a wicked place.
So,
And of course, the Patriot leaders in Williamsburg were the ones who set them to it. It wasn't just a destructive rampage in the fog of war.
so in the end, was there any restitution paid? Was anybody compensated?
Not that I could find. I think there were a few larger landowners who might have received something, but the trail kind of went dead. The vast majority of people received nothing. They lost everything. Not to mention the free blacks who lost not just their property and their homes, but couldn't return without potentially being enslaved. So it was a real the impact on the people was tremendous. And ultimately, it really hurt Virginia because Virginia remained a backward colony and a backward state well into the 20th century. It didn't have this kind of economic motor that Charleston and Savannah and New York and Boston were for their states.
Mhm.
So, Thomas Jefferson is the one who envisioned this kind of cityless state, and he got it. And he realized too late in his life that the state had become, I think he called it like Barbary, become a barbarous
Mhm.
place where the
Mhm.
biggest export were slaves sold to the Deep South. So
Interesting.
the destruction of Norfolk had huge implications, and I think it exposed uh, the terrible truth behind Jefferson's philosophy.
Do you think the city of Norfolk will ever acknowledge what you're saying, and will they ever maybe put a museum there to this effect, or maybe put a plaque? And will you be there at the dedication to talk
Well,
about?
we are gonna have a symposium in Norfolk at the Slover Library on November 14th,
Oh, great.
2025, the day before the anniversary of the proclamation. And we're going to gather scholars from around the country to talk about what happened in Virginia and try to bring in new research and really kind of fire up people so that they know what happened. I think mostly people in Norfolk are unaware of their history because their history was wiped out. The city was destroyed. And
Right.
it's I think there's just people don't know what happened. And it's such an exciting and important story in American history that I'm
Right.
hoping that people can get fired up. And yes, historical markers and more education about what happened, I think, can only benefit.
Well, your book is going to go a long way to doing that, and it's just fantastic. It's one of the few real page turners I've read that's about history. So I really think
Great.
it was a
Well,
fantastic book.
that's a great honor because I know you do a lot of history reading.
What do you think we can do to get some of the things reversed on the internet? The Wikipedias of the world, to get them to actually reflect the full story.
Yeah. Well, it's a task for all of us to take on, and this is a great time. This 250th anniversary, the spotlight is going to be on the American Revolution, so it's a great time to get people thinking about it in new and fresh ways and more accurate ways.
So my last question about the book is: did you end up liking Lord Dunmore, and do you think the reader likes Lord Dunmore, or is it complicated?
Um, Well, I don't think that he necessarily would have been my cup of tea, but I really came to admire him because he was such an iconoclast. At the end of his life, there's a quote from Jeremy Bentham, a very famous British philosopher, and he said, "Oh, I used to do chemistry experiments with Lord Dunmore," and he was a man of very liberal sensibilities, I think was the phrase. And he said he shocked me much one day when he said that he thought that revelation had come not just through Jesus, but through others as well. Um, and this apparently was really shocking to Jeremy Bentham, who was actually a very well-known atheist at the time.
Right.
So it made me, think of Dunmore as somebody who started out as kind of a small town, minor aristocrat, and through these incredible experiences, he grew as a person. He became open-minded. He was curious. He could see beyond prejudice in a way that was very unusual for the time. And so while he wasn't a card carrying abolitionist, in some ways he's more interesting than the abolitionist because he came at it from a different angle. He really started to see these people, and not as a cause. So, I think there's something very compelling about somebody who did something so radical without knowing the implications, and who, in some ways, we could think of as a founder of this country because he did what the founders should have done but did not do, and that is to begin mass emancipation of enslaved people. So his proclamation paved the way for Lincoln's more famous Emancipation Proclamation. And I think there's a direct line there. So I think that we should honor this man, but more importantly, we should honor the enslaved people who risked their lives to go to Dunmore and say, we're here, we're ready to fight. Without them, without their agency, none of this would have happened.
100%. Do you think Lincoln looked at his proclamation as kind of a model for his? Is there any
Uh,
evidence of that?
Well, there's no evidence that Lincoln ever mentioned the word Dunmore because he understood that he was still a hated person in the South. But we do know that a couple of his advisors specifically mentioned Dunmore's proclamation as one of the key legal precedents that they needed to say that during wartime it's okay for a leader to emancipate enslaved people. And
Interesting.
so Dunmore's proclamation and later Henry Clinton's proclamation did that. So really they used Dunmore's proclamation as cover to be able to do what they did in 1863.
Interesting. I don't think I've ever been turned around on one person more than Dunmore by reading your book. And so I think
Right.
you really effectively researched it, or effectively wrote it. And anybody who reads it, I think is going to feel the same way.
Well, he was my childhood villain, so I do think about him quite differently now.
So can you give us a little preview on what you're working on next?
Not yet, but stay tuned. I do have some articles coming out related to this book in the coming months. So for the moment, it's all about the revolution.
Okay. Well, very good. I'm really excited about it. I want to thank you so much, Andrew Lawler, for being on again to talk about your great book, A Perfect Frenzy. And hopefully you'll come on when your next work is out.
I would be delighted. Well, thanks so much for taking all the time.
Have a fantastic evening.
All right. Bye, Tom.
See you next time.